Ladies and gentlemen, more likely just the gentlemen, today we're going to be answering the very important question, what bond store tanks are worth it? And to do that, we're going to be going through a tier list ranking several bond store tanks so that by the end of this video, you'll be able to make an informed decision on what tanks are worth it and which ones are definitely not worth your time. To start off, I want to make things clear that I will only be covering tier 8 premiums and the single tier 9 premium tank that is in the bond store. I'm doing this not because I don't think the other tanks are worth it, but because most people who ask this question are looking for premium tanks to grind credits in and ones that are reasonably fun to play in. I will also be letting you know that the ratings that I give are going to be somewhat subjective, and for this reason I'm going to be pulling in information from websites like TomatoGG and Skill Index so that I can be as objective as possible when I give these rankings. For the 21 tanks that I have here, we're going to rank each into 4 categories: must-haves, solid choice, underrated, and situational, and then the ones you absolutely want to avoid. And for your guys' time's sake, you'll be able to navigate all these rankings using the timestamps that I've included in this video. With this all said, we're going to kick things off with ranking 3 of the tanks that I think are absolutely diabolical, and I do not mean this in a good way. We're going to be ranking ones that I would avoid. First, to start off, we're going to start with the famous Chieftain. This variant is by far the worst Chieftain. It has 0 armor, it may have gun depression, but it has 0 speed. Guys, I'm wasting time by talking about it. You should not get this tank until it is buffed. Please do not touch it. Falling into the same category is the M46KR. This thing has decent view range, it has decent enough gun handling, but it is not enough to save it from being a far worse M26 Pershing. It just sucks. Don't get it. It's not good in this meta. 240 is not enough as this type of medium tank. The gun handling is not good enough in order to outweigh all the other disadvantages that it has in today's current meta. Now, the next tank to grace our list is going to be the IS-5. This buddy is terrible. And, you know, the stats don't really lie on this. Based on TomatoGG, it's actually one of the few bond-heavy tanks available that will make you on average lose. And this is something you're going to be paying, I think, 10,000 bonds for, if I'm correct. So this is 10,000 bonds to get an on average 1% less win rate. Now, why is this? I mean, let's just take a look at the stats. It's not as if this thing on paper looks all that terrible. You have 42 top speed. That's good for this meta. It's an okay power to weight. Has good enough health. The armor on paper seems fine. We'll take a look at that later. The range is pretty atrocious. 7 degrees of gun depression is actually pretty good. Shell velocity is nice, you know, yeah. If you want to group all the tanks by the hit percentage, would you look at that? The IS-5 is at the very bottom. It's because its gun is terrible. This thing is shite. And to put it slightly, the armor does not work either. Why is that? Well, see this thing right here? It gets overmatched all the time by literally anything that's over 90 millimeters. Overmatched instant pen. Cupola, also crap. Lower, it's decent, but if you're facing this way, anybody's going to be penning you, even tier 7s. Do yourself a favor, save the 10,000 bonds, do not buy this. Enough said. Let's move on. The next 3 tanks we're going to be ranking are going to be what I would call solid choices. These are maybe not must-haves, but if you have the extra bonds, they're definitely worth looking at. The first one I'm going to be ranking is going to be the T-34-3. This tank in my mind has 3 key strengths that place it at this ranking. Let me highlight those for you guys. When we take a look at the stats, there's nothing all too actually special about this tank. It has decent DPM, actually pretty bad accuracy, and okay dispersion factors. The real thing that I think is excellent about this tank is the armor for its tiers that it meets. This will only meet up to tier 9s, and I think it's excellent for what it's facing. When you're going to be side scraping, you have 80 millimeters of side armor, which really does keep this thing bouncing quite a few shells. In addition, you have a turret that's going to withstand most things at tier 8 and most things at tier 9. So it's not a worry that you should have. In addition, I think the penetration values are good enough for what it's going to be facing. That is mainly tier 8 and below and tier 9s. And one of the main things that I think is so understated about this tank is that it has 390 alpha. There are not a lot of tier 8 medium tanks in general that have this punching power that is able to keep up with a lot of heavy tanks, and I think this is a really refreshing thing to play and could absolutely do a lot of good brawling if you get it into the right situation and if you know what you're doing. So we're going to be moving on to the next one in our list, which is going to be the light tank, the Senlac. This is something I have featured quite a bit on my channel, and I do have a slight soft spot for this tank, only because it is it is the only British light tank, and I like British tanks in general, and I would classify this tank as an all-rounder. Now, there's a lot that I could say about this tank, but I want to make it concise down to 3 points. This thing is fast enough to get into the key positions that you will be able to contest other light tanks in. It has excellent V range, especially when you pair it with CVS, that will allow it to outspot other light tanks in a stationary battle. And it has the gun that will actually hit targets and do it effectively. I think a lot of light tanks, and there's going to be another one in this list, where the shell velocity, I think, lets it down, even though its damage capabilities are better than the Senlac. This thing has a HE shell that is excellent. It may be 280 for alpha damage, but it actually hits its targets. It can hit moving targets with ease, which I think is very beginner friendly, and its DPM isn't half bad. Now, the next tank I want to talk about is another medium tank with 390 alpha. This is going to be the STG Guard right here. Now, the reason why I'm placing it in the solid choice category is for 3 reasons. Number 1, it has a 390 alpha gun with decent penetration for its tier. Secondly, and to not be understated, this has the 5th best camo of all of the tier 8 medium tanks, which means if it needs to, it can play as a tank destroyer. Lastly, I want to say that this thing has a good HP pool, which does keep it in the game for longer than some medium tanks. Occasionally you get the bounce, but the armor in general is unreliable. The one bad thing I will say about this tank is that sometimes the accuracy is offset by the shell velocity, which will make the shells dip at distance, but if you're playing at medium to long range, most of the time it's going to be able to hit. And the other thing I need to say about this is that vertical stabilizers are absolutely mandatory on this thing, as it doesn't have the best dispersion factors. But overall, I think this is a good tank and it's a solid pickup. And before we get on to the next section where I'm going to be sharing 2 of the must-have tanks from the Bond store, if you guys are enjoying this video, let me know by dropping a like so that the video can get out to more people and that my channel can grow. The next tank we're going to be talking about should surprise absolutely nobody. This is going to be the Lorraine 40 ton. Now, what makes this tank stand out among the competition in here? Number 1, it is the only autoloader in the entire Bond store, which makes it unique for that reason alone. But number 2 is the fact that it has great penetration values for its standard round at 232, meaning you can actually play this without any gold and still perform really well. Mind you, the gun handling is okay, and it will need vertical stabilizers, but this isn't a huge sacrifice because all of the other aspects of the tank are quite good. And one of those that I wanted to highlight is its speed. In this meta, it's really important to be able to deliver your damage, in this case it's a 1200 clip, and be able to reposition and run away or change flanks if you must. So this tank is excellent as far as teaching you how to play autoloaders and be sneaky and run away, but it also keeps up with the meta, and that's why I thoroughly recommend this tank to anybody who's looking for a credit-earning autoloader from the Bond store. The next tank that'll be making its way to the must-have section is one that I dislike so much that I actually sold it for credits out of spite before it eventually got its buffs recently. This is going to be the T26 E5, and let me explain to you why now it is one of the best choices that you can get from the Bond store. Number 1, this thing has great penetration of 230 on its standard round, which means that this is a great credit earner, and this solid penetration comes paired with good DPM and gun handling. But the gun handling wasn't always the case. Back before its buffs, it actually used to be very annoying to play, and it meant that vertical stabilizers was a must-take on this, while now you can actually drop vertical stabilizers and have a totally usable gun. Now, some people will say that 240 alpha damage is not enough to compete against other heavies, but the way you should be playing this tank and the way that I play this tank is by going to the medium flanks and bullying medium tanks with my mobility and my armor combination paired with the gun. It works really well, and I farm a ton of credits by playing that way. Overall, I would say this tank is relatively easy to play. You go hull down, you use your DPM to pressure the enemies, and try to take 2 shots for every 1 shot that they're getting on you. So it definitely has my recommendation. However, there is one other tank that I would put above the Lorraine and the T26, but we're going to get to that a little bit later in the video. First, we're going to be talking about a tank that I think needed the buffs and did not quite get what I thought it should have. I still don't think it's very good, and I might be in a little bit of a minority here, but this is going to be my rating of the AMX Liberté. Listen, this thing should be good, but I find its armor to just not hold up. It has a cupola that is remarkably easy to hit. It's vulnerable to heat, I find it to be very sluggish. I don't find the gun handling to be good even after the buffs, and even though it has good penetration, it doesn't help if I'm not actually hitting the targets. This thing eats a lot of dirt, and I'm not quite sure if it's just because it's the French tank curse, but at least with a 40T, I have another 3 shots that I can potentially hit, whereas with this one, the DPM just makes it feel very punishing to play when you do miss it. And for being only 300 alpha damage, and it still has poor gun handling, this one really makes it a deal breaker for me in particular. It can work for some people, it doesn't work for me. You can check out the stats, what I'm going to put on screen here as far as the way other people play it and other people's ratings. For me, it's one of them that I want to put in a void, but I know since it's decent, I am going to put it in the underrated / situational section. Now, the next tank that is going to be making the list on the underrated and situational ranking is the Almighty Defender. Now, when this thing came out, it was the epitome of overpowered and power creep. It had 440 alpha damage. It had an impervious armor layout. It had -6 degrees of gun depression for a Soviet tank. This was scary stuff back then, believe it or not. And nobody knew how to take it out. Well, things are very much different today because this thing is blind as a bat, it's slow, everybody knows where to shoot it for the weak spots, and its gun cannot fight back because it's the original problem that it always had. Its gun handling is shite. Plain and simple, it's just really not good. Now, it's one thing if you enjoy playing tanks with bad gun handling and good armor. However, this is not my cup of tea, and I think for the average player out there who's looking for a good credit maker and actually wants to hit their shots, there are many better options that we're going to get to, so let's continue on with the list. The next tank we're going to be talking about is the Mutz. Now, let me be clear, I don't think this tank is necessarily bad, but it's just old, and it feels old, and it shows. This tank comes from the era where premium tanks are quite balanced, and they didn't have any outstanding factors, but that's the exact problem that we have here, is that this tank has 0 outstanding factors. It's just average and below average in a lot of different ways. Now, 250 alpha isn't necessarily bad if it's paired with DPM, but this thing doesn't have the greatest of DPM, and the penetration factors, while they're decent, are not enough to save this tank. One of the nice things about the tank, though, is that it does have a good HE shell, which eats up a lot of paper targets really easily, so there is that going for it, but I personally don't think it's enough to bump this thing up any higher than underrated and situational. Now, without any more illusion or teasing, the next tank that we're going to be doing belongs to the must-have section. This is the #1 tank that I think is absolutely worthy of being your first Bond Store tank because it is fun, it is consistent, and damn, well, I like it a lot, and I'm gonna tell you why. If you guys already know it, come on now, we already know what it is. It's the T103. Let me explain to you why this is my #1 pick from the Bond Store, and why I think it should be your first Bond Store tank. First and foremost, this thing can actually overmatch the roof of BZs. And while a Defender can also do that because it has a 130mm gun, it is nowhere tall enough nor accurate enough to actually hit the roof. So for this reason, I think it is actually a very worthy mention because BZs are very prevalent at tier 8. This thing gets to deal with it, and it can deal with it in many ways. The second way that it will be able to deal with heavily armored targets is because this thing has excellent, such good penetration. You could play this thing without any gold and be just fine. But one of the highlights is actually the gold. 306mm of penetration with AP normalization is amazing. Like, the normal shell is good enough to deal with anything your tier and below, and the gold shell is absolutely more than enough to deal with most tier 10s and heavily armored targets frontally. And to show you how I kit up my T103 for the best performance, I've been running it with the rotation mechanism, the hardening, and also the rammer for the DPM. The DPM gets up to around 2900, which is absolutely respectable when you're considering that you're kind of a faux heavy. You end up having a 9-second reload. The dispersion is excellent, great accuracy, gun handling's all right. You have the health to hang around with the heavies, and you also have the mobility to keep up with them as well. So all things considered, I think the T103 is a great pickup for anybody who's looking for a consistent credit earner and for something that has some staying power, so that when it's spotted, it doesn't just evaporate. But we're going to continue on with the list, and the next tank is one that I would love to put in the must-have category, but it doesn't quite make it there. But for personal reasons and for the reasons of what I'm about to show you, it does make it into the solid choice category. I'm talking about the KV-5 today. Now, is this tank meta? No. Does it have an amazing gun? Also no. Does it have impervious armor? Nope. but it can do this.
Oh, just. Oh! Alright, peace out, motherfucker.
Put simply, the KV-5 is an absolute meme tank with a ton of meme potential that is hilarious to play with friends. And to be honest, it kind of sometimes tanks with its HP and trolls with its armor. So sometimes you will end up having the weird carry on this tank where you're like, wow, I really just did that. That's the KV-5 for you. Unpredictable and absolutely fun and worth the 8,000 bonds. Now, if the KV-5 was a one-trick pony for its ramming and its meme potential, the next one is definitely a one-trick pony for side scraping. This is going to be the Chrysler. And when this tank first came out, it was actually quite controversial, and that was really because of its armor model. Let me show you what I mean by this. Frontally, this thing has very few weak spots. You need like 260 millimeters in order to pen the cupola right here, and other than that, its hull was really strong. So when it was released, this thing was extremely good. Nowadays, I would say it starts to do a little bit worse. You can see I'm facing up against it with heat, and we start to get some weaknesses in the armor. Now, when this thing starts facing up against tier 9 and tier 10, the armor, it doesn't exist. And to be honest, with everything else in here, it starts to kind of be a little bit weak. But against tier 8 and tier 9, it is effective, especially when you're min-maxing like this. It's very nimble, it has enough DPM and enough penetration. I just personally think once you get above tier 9, this thing stops becoming effective. And it's not my first choice just because the base penetration is so low. And especially if you're looking for something to make credits with, it's not the best choice. But I'm putting it here in the solid choice category because it's just a good performer at what it does, not because it's necessarily a great tank for making credits. But moving on to the next tank, one that's a little bit more expensive and one that's very similar to the KV-5 in playstyle is the KV-4 Krivslavsky. Now, with this tank, it's really interesting because you're paying 2,000 extra bonds for the KV-5's experience and to also face tier 10s. And what you get as a trade-off is less DPM, worse armor in some regards, and worse ramming potential for the trade-off of penetration. And it's just, personally, it's not worth it to me. But based off community ratings and based off of its side scraping potential, which I personally think is decent enough to warrant it being at this level, the gun handling also as well is quite good. I think it could be at the solid choice. I will also say because of the penetration and your ammo choices, the 289 and the gold's great, by the way. So I think it's okay. But for 10,000 bonds, I would also almost put it in the underrated situational thing. But I'm putting it here because its performance is good enough to be here. I'm having a little bit of trouble with this one. I would put it in between there if I did have a tier for here. But perhaps, you know what? I'm actually going to rate it in the underrated situational. I think the KV-5 overall is a little bit better. I know it's a little bit of deliberation on the go, but that's where my gut is telling me to place it. But for the next tank, I don't really need to deliberate at all, and that's because this thing is just horrendous. It is the WZ-114. Now, part of me wants to love this tank for how terrible it is, and for some reason, I actually tend to play very well in it, but that's not really saying much because I also make the Caliban work very, very well. But putting my opinion and experience aside, I think this tank is terrible for the average player. The gun handling is atrocious, like unfairly atrocious, especially when the Tiger Mouse exists and has decent gun handling with the same amount of alpha damage. Now, the HP pool is great, the armor is okay, and the speed's actually not as bad as some people say it is. But the thing is that this thing cannot fight back, and it has such bad DPM. And while it's nice that you can farm credits and also get bonds at the same time, the experience of this tank is such that you might as well play a tier 8 premium and get the full amount of credits, and then also just play tier 10 and get the bonds. It's just, personally, I don't think it's worth it, especially for the price that they're asking. And another tank that I think absolutely belongs in the avoid section is the Stridsvang 81. Now, there is so much wrong with this tank, but I think this clip captures most of it perfectly, so let it roll.
Ricochet. Early turn it. Let's find another target. Penetration. We didn't even scratch them. We're done for.
Said simply, it has bad DPM, bad gun handling, bad shell normalization, bad hull armor, and it also just feels slower than it should be for a medium tank when I'm using a turbo. All in all, just avoid this tank, save your bonds. The next tank I think is worth it, But the way I'm going to rate it is probably going to make some of you a little bit uncomfortable. This is going to be the Black Dog, and I believe it to be on the underrated side of things / situational. And there's a couple reasons why I'm rating it lower than a solid choice category, and I'm going to make this clear to you. I believe that the Black Dog is a great medium light tank hybrid, but that is the exact problem that it also has, is that it's not good enough at damage output to make it a true medium, and it's definitely not light enough to actually contest other lights in this list, much less the other lights at tier 8. And more specifically, what I mean by this is that one of the main things that holds this tank back is its camouflage and its speed. This is one of the slowest light tanks as far as power to weight goes that there is. And honestly, it is a problem when you're trying to run away. It's a problem when you're trying to get in positions to contest other light tanks. Additionally, what I also find as far as the damage output, and this is just more minor, is the fact that the shell velocity is so slow makes you have to lead targets a lot more. And this is not a problem for skilled players, but it is absolutely a problem for people who are beginners who are not as used to leading their shots as much. And I think the fastest shell is 800 meters per second. That's the HE, and everything else is slower. So this is a notable thing to say, especially when other light tanks have faster shell velocities. It makes hitting your targets a lot easier, and it makes your accuracy slightly better because they don't dip as much at long range. But that's my opinion on this. Let me know what you guys think about this. Fight me in the comment section. Let me know your feedback. But for me, it's more of a situational tank. I still enjoy it, but I definitely enjoy my Hawk 30 a lot more. The next tank, which is going to be the light tank, is the M41D. Now, I'm going to be ranking this very similarly because they have extremely similar playstyles. Although this thing has much better DPM, the problem is that it is also a faux medium / light tank, meaning that it can't fully contest mediums in a 1-to-1 fight, and it definitely cannot fully contest light tanks in head-on spotting matches. And that's just because of its size and its camo. One of the things I'm going to re-highlight is that it does have great DPM. This cannot be understated. This is a mean light tank as far as fighting goes. It has great penetration, great gun handling, and it does have decent view range. So if you are the only light tank and you're going up against something that's also another brawling light tank, something that's versatile, then you are going to do very well. And I think one of the things, the reason why it belongs here, and it definitely doesn't belong in a void, is because the stats don't lie on this thing, and it's actually an overperformer. So I would never put it in a void. I do think it's situational only because of its limited camo, but that's my rating of it. Moving on, we're going to be going to the Chinese Tier 8 preferential matchmaking tank. This is going to be the WZ-111 Alpine Tiger. Now, one of the reasons why it almost makes it a solid choice is the fact that this thing's trade-in value is so high that if you were going to trade it in for something like an ELC EVA 90, you only have to pay 300 gold, which means this thing's trade-in value makes it like a awesome, like almost a must-have thing if you are specifically looking to trade in for another tank, a better premium tank, especially if you're looking to get the ELC EVA 90 for really cheap. This is an excellent choice. But concerning the tank itself, this is generally an all-rounder. Listen, it has decent penetration for what you're going up against. It has a 250 heat pen to deal with tier 9s. It has great top speed. I don't think the gun handling's as bad as a lot of people will tell you. The armor does hold up decently. You have two cupolas on either side, which does make it a little bit hard to go haul down in some situations. But if you're wiggling around and you're backing up behind walls while you're trying to brawl, you're generally going to do well in this tank. Now, the tank that I think is a little bit worse than the WZ-111 Alpine Tiger is the IS-6. Now, this thing also has amazing DPM for a tier 8 heavy, but the main reason why I'm putting it in the situational section is for two main reasons. This thing does not have the penetration to go up against a lot of the power creep armored vehicles that are now in the game, and it does not have the armor to withstand those vehicles that it's going up against as well. And that is just me being fair to it. It has an overmatchable roof. The whole armor isn't really all that great. The cheeks are quite big, and they're very easy to penetrate, especially if you try to side scrape. It can't reverse side scrape. So generally, I just don't think it's a great choice. And for a preferential matchmaking tank, I think there are other better options on this list that I've already mentioned. If you do have free bonds and you really want another tank, sure. But generally, I would just say save your bonds and go get equipment or save up for another special tank, which is a totally viable choice and likely the correct choice to make if you are a person who already owns a lot of the tanks that are available in the Bond shop. And I can confidently say that is probably the right choice to make because I fell victim to the FOMO curiosity trap by buying some of these tanks that I really wish I could have saved my 8,000 bonds on. But that's exactly why I made this video, to suggest tanks that I think are actually worth it, and to steer you away from tanks that I think are absolutely not worth your time, and more importantly, your bonds. Now, I'm going to continue to make videos with the primary goal being to offer you guys value and to be engaging every single time I put something out. So if you guys want to join me in this channel's growth, consider subscribing, as I'm going to be pushing out some content that is going to be really interesting and fun that'll make you guys think. And one of the videos that I've done with this is right here on the screen right now. If you guys are interested in it, click it. But regardless, I hope you guys have a great day, and I will catch you guys soon in the next one. Peace.